Hello everyone, Hunter here, and welcome to the first video of my new channel, Stories of Reddit. On this channel, we'll dive into subreddits like malicious compliance, petty revenge, pro-revenge, short stories, no sleep, and more. Today, however, we start with two of my own stories, one from malicious compliance and one from petty revenge. Enjoy. My first story is titled, "The Only Time I've Ever Heard of Someone Getting in Trouble for Doing More Than Required." And yes, this is absolutely a true story. This turned out to be much longer than I thought it would, especially for a first-timer, but I hope you find it worth it. Many years ago, I worked at a company that manufactured medical and scientific testing machines. Think shakers, small centrifuges, etc. Now, I originally started there as a machinist until I hurt my knee at work, and 8 years and 5 surgeries later, it's still not fixed. After my injury, I switched over to the assembly side because that was far more accommodating to my new limitations. Long story short, I was very good at my job, coming up with new ways to streamline several processes, new ways to assemble various things quicker than before, generally doing more work than my job description called for, and even having the temerity to prove the engineers wrong on multiple occasions. With everything I could do, I knew the company would need to hire at least 3 people to replace me should I leave. It was announced one day that the assembly manager was leaving that job, whether for another position within the company or the company altogether, I don't really recall, and anyone who was interested could apply for it, with the promise that inside personnel would have the inside track over outside applicants. I put together my resume and went for it. The son-in-law of the company's owner was doing the interviews, which I aced. He went so far as to tell me that my resume was by far the most professional and complete he'd ever seen, but I didn't get the job. No hard feelings, I just went back to doing what I had been doing. Well, as it turned out, they hired a friend of the owner's son-in-law as the new assembly manager. So much for that inside track, huh? It seemed to me, as well as my coworkers, that we weren't even at the same race course, but whatever, I could deal with it. I don't know what that guy's previous work experience was, but it became abundantly clear very early on that he was out of his depth. He had no clue why and how things were done the way they were, but he decided a couple weeks after his hiring that he was going to change everything about the assembly area. One of the things he decided was that we were no longer allowed to exceed the number of machines scheduled to be assembled that day, nor were we permitted to skip over machines to get to others, regardless of the issue. Engineering issues, bad parts, wrong parts from the warehouse, etc. And some of those parts came from the machine shop side, but many were from outside companies too. But we also weren't allowed to stand around waiting for new parts from the warehouse. We couldn't even get with the warehouse personnel to help find parts we needed or help them get the parts into our assembly area. No more doing more became our mantra. Productivity and quality plummeted. Needless to say, none of the assembly team was happy in the slightest. I tried, I really did, but I have issues with not doing things to the best of my ability. I also have issues with not being able to fill my workday with work. You know, what I'm being paid for? I would be the absolute worst person to ask about quiet quitting. A few months into the new assembly manager's tenure, my station was at a standstill due to an engineering problem with a new variant of machine that I could practically build blindfolded. I had 4 or 5 college-educated engineers crowding my station attempting to figure out a problem that arose only after the machine was fully assembled, which I explained exactly how it could be fixed with minimal effort, by the way, and I was correct, but that's a different story. While waiting for the engineers to come to the same conclusion as me, they did, eventually, I went to the warehouseman responsible for pulling the parts I needed to assemble and asked him to switch over to a different machine I was going to build. The assembly manager happened to wander over just then and asked what I was doing. I explained the situation with the engineers and that I was currently unable to work on those machines, and rather than standing there and looking lazy, I was trying to get a jump start on the other machines I needed to build that day. At no point did I get sarcastic, which is my normal mode of communication, or mean, nor was I flippant in any way whatsoever. I was merely trying to get some work done that we both knew needed to get done. He started loudly berating me in front of the entire shop, both the assembly area and the machine shop, specifically saying, "You're not allowed to do more than what I tell you to do, in the order I tell you to do it." I placated him as best I could and went back to my work area, which was still overrun with engineers, and settled down for a long wait. Cue the malicious compliance, because I didn't work on another machine for the rest of the day. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was told I wasn't allowed. A couple of hours later, I was called into the assembly manager's office for a meeting. I was expecting another stern talking to, which I could handle. Being ex-military, I'd long grown accustomed to being chewed out by people who didn't know how to do the job I was doing. What I was not accustomed to was getting a write-up for trying to do my job, especially since the official reason was insubordination. The assembly manager didn't even have the courage to do it himself. He foisted it off on my immediate supervisor, who wasn't involved in the prior situation and had no idea what had happened earlier. I think he was busy putting out a different fire. When he asked what happened that justified my first and only write-up in the 2.5 years I'd worked for the company, I explained it to him, and all he could do was shake his head in disbelief. He was a good supervisor, at least when it came to getting the best out of most people, but he also wasn't really known for rocking the boat to stick up for his people. That being said, when he tried to get me to sign it, I refused because I obviously disagreed. He said he understood, but he'd have to talk to the assembly manager about it, and that did not go well. I could hear the yelling half a building away, despite the machinery running. Once again, I was called to the assembly manager's office, but this time I was facing the assembly manager himself. He immediately started yelling at me again, but not just about the earlier incident. Now he wanted to know why I hadn't built the day's allotment of machines. I coolly reminded him that not only was there an engineering problem with the machines I was supposed to be building, he told me not to work on any other machines, and to do so was insubordination, as he so callously put it in the write-up. Then he asked me if I was going to sign the write-up. Once again, I refused. I don't think it's right or fair to be reprimanded for doing my job. If you don't like it, he said through clenched teeth, find another job. I can find 1,000 people who can do that job. I never said otherwise, jackass. I was fed up now and refused to tamp down my anger any longer. But you'll need at least 3 people to do everything I can do as easily and as well as I can. Good luck with that. I left him standing there, completely flustered, went to my work area to gather my personal effects, and walked over to my supervisor. I informed him that I was going home and would like to use my accrued personal time off and vacation time for the next 2 weeks. He told me it was no problem, and as he was approving my request, I let him know that I was also giving my 2-week notice and wouldn't be back. He shook my hand and wished me well in my future endeavors. I did the same and left. I got to leave on my own terms, and through my son, who also worked there, as well as various friends I'd made while working there, I did learn that the company had to hire no less than 5 people to replace me and my expertise. I also got the last laugh because I'm pretty sure the assembly manager got fired a couple of years later for various reasons, not least of which was the lagging productivity and his driving a mass exodus of the best personnel in the assembly area out. To be perfectly honest, looking back at this incident, I probably could have handled things a little better. At the time, however, I was just so fed up with the guy I could barely think straight, and getting reprimanded for trying to do my job was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Let me know in the comments how you would have handled it. Now, on to my next story. This next story comes out of the subreddit Petty Revenge, and is titled Dad's Last Second Change of Mind Becomes Vengeance Upon a Deadbeat Mother. Yes, this is a true story. This actually happened to me. It's kind of crazy, but it's not even the worst thing that ever happened between the two of us. Maybe someday I'll actually get around to telling those stories, but this one is just kind of par for the course at the time. I'm new to Reddit in general, and Petty Revenge in particular, so I'll just have to hope this story fits. I won't bore you with all the sordid details of my past relationship with my now 30-year-old son's female birth parent. I call her the egg donor in real life because she's never been his mother. That particular honor belongs to my wife, who I met when my son was 8. The short version is, like many young people often do, the egg donor and I thought that having a child would help our failing relationship. I was 23 when my namesake was born, she was 26. As is the norm, it didn't work. For reasons that belong in a different story, we split up when my son was 8 months old. Walking out of the apartment we shared without taking my son with me was the hardest thing I'd ever experienced in my life up to that point, and will likely remain so until the day my mother draws her last breath. I was devastated. After my own less than ideal childhood, all I'd ever wanted was my own family, but I had to walk away, for my own mental health if nothing else. Physical health too, but also a different story. It turned out that period of my life didn't last that long, because 2 days after my son's first birthday, she called me to ask if I wanted my son. I literally jumped at the chance. I picked him up less than an hour later, and he lived with me from that day until his junior year of high school. We were moving and he didn't want to leave, so he stayed with a friend's family until he graduated. The egg donor, however, promptly disappeared for about a year and a half. No address, no phone number, no way to contact her whatsoever. To simplify the rest of the story, she came back from wherever she'd wandered off to, and we settled into an uneasy agreement for visitation for the next couple of years. Although there was the time she didn't show up when we went to court for official custody, which I needed in order to enroll him in school. At the time of the custody hearing, she lived within walking distance of the courthouse, and by walking distance I mean less than a mile. Then one day, out of the complete blue, she decided to take me to court for official, court-ordered visitation, with all that entailed. At first I intended to fight her tooth and nail, and if you knew the entire story you'd understand why, but again, this isn't that story, even up to and including the day of court. I was thinking about the myriad reasons why I believed she shouldn't have official visitation rights, as she was telling the judge why she should. It's important for me to note that I would never have kept my son from her, and never did, despite the many reasons to do so. I also tried my best never to speak ill of her in his presence. I failed in that, although it was rare, even though I knew she wasn't going to do the same. I wanted him to reach his own conclusions about her and didn't want to color his perception of her with my own. They have very, very minimal contact now, if any, to the point that she wasn't even invited to his wedding or the birth of his son, while my wife and I were, although my wife couldn't attend. It's also important to note that, although I had physical custody of my son, she had not paid me a single red cent for anything I needed to care for him. Clothing, food, diapers, medicines, nothing. Cue the petty revenge part of this story. As the judge asked me if I had a problem with official visitation arrangements, I changed my mind, simply stating, "No, I don't have a problem with it, as long as I get child support and half my babysitting bill paid," surprising the egg donor, who had anticipated a fight. And truth be told, even though I spoke the words, they surprised even me. The judge banged her gavel, saying, "Done," before the egg donor could even think of protesting. If looks could kill, I'd have died in blazing hellfire on that very spot that day, and I am not joking. There was pure, unadulterated, murderous intent behind those eyes. It took a really long time for the Division of Youth and Family Services to enforce the order, due to egg donor getting Social Security disability insurance, which, at the time, couldn't be automatically attached, and she actually wound up in jail for non-payment. I believe she was at least $5,000 in arrears if I recall correctly, which is also a different story, but in the end, she wound up paying. Eventually. In retrospect, this was probably another situation I could have handled better, but at the time, I was more concerned with protecting my son as much as possible, and I was still angry at the egg donor for what she did to cause our split. Don't get me wrong, we were definitely doomed, no matter what. There was no saving that relationship. It was the way she sped the process up, for lack of a better term. Someday I might be ready to tell that story, but for now, suffice it to say that April is still a bad month for me, even 30 years later. To this day, I get melancholy about it, and often just wonder what if. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. If you've stuck around this long, help me out by dropping a like, hit that subscribe button, and leave a comment about these stories. Constructive criticism is welcome, but please stay civilized in the comments. I don't want to have to use the ban hammer so early in this channel's life. If you have any posts on Reddit you'd like me to use in a video, feel free to email them to me at the address on the channel's About page, and I'll see what I can do. I don't have a proper sign-off yet, so I'll just say, see ya!